Welcome back to the Sleepy Detective. The country of Canada is often defined by its vast, quiet landscapes and its reputation for peace. But even in the most serene places, a profound darkness can take root. Tonight, we are exploring the unsettling exceptions to that peace. 10 stories of individuals whose actions left indelible scars on the nation's sense of security. Our journey will be a calm and steady one, focused on the quiet details and the lingering questions. It is a space for you to relax, to focus, or to simply let the story unfold as you drift away. So, find your comfortable place and let us begin. Our journey begins on the West Coast, in the beautiful, rain-swept province of British Columbia during the early 1980s. This was a time of relative innocence, a period before the constant connectivity of the modern world. A time when children still played with a freedom that seems distant today. But in the spring and summer of 1981, a shadow fell over the lower mainland, a creeping dread that began with the quiet disappearance of a single child and grew into a full-blown panic that gripped the entire region. This was the work of a man whose name would become synonymous with predatory evil in Canada. A man who did not just take lives, but who seemed to revel in the chaos and pain he created. This is the story of Clifford Olson. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, on the 1st of January, 1940. From his earliest years, his life was marked by instability and a growing pattern of antisocial behavior. He was a pathological liar, a petty thief, and a bully. His official criminal record began when he was still a teenager, and it quickly became a revolving door of arrests, convictions, and incarcerations. His rap sheet was a long and varied list of offenses: fraud, theft, armed robbery, parole violations, and escaping custody. He spent the vast majority of his adult life behind bars. By the time he was 40, he had accumulated over 90 convictions and had served all but 4 years of his adult life in prison. He was, by all accounts, a deeply unpleasant and manipulative individual. He was a braggart and a narcissist, constantly trying to present himself as a criminal mastermind, a tough guy who was smarter than everyone else. In reality, he was a small-time grifter and a con artist, a man whose primary skills were manipulation and deceit. He was married and had a young son, presenting a thin veneer of normalcy to the outside world. He worked odd jobs, often in construction, but his true vocation was crime. His long history as a career criminal, however, gave no hint of the monstrous escalation that was to come. He was seen by the authorities as a nuisance, a habitual offender, but not as a killer. This perception would allow him to operate under the radar, beginning a reign of terror that would last for 8 horrifying months. The nightmare began on November 17th, 1980. 12-year-old Christine Weller of Surrey, British Columbia, disappeared. She had been on her way to a friend's house, a short journey she had made countless times before. She never arrived. Her disappearance was reported, but in the initial stages, it was treated as a potential runaway case. There was no immediate sense of the profound danger that had just been unleashed. On Christmas Day, her remains were found by a pair of hikers in a wooded area. She had been killed by strangulation. The discovery sent a shockwave of fear through the community, but the connection to a serial predator was not yet made. The pace of the disappearances then quickened, creating a climate of intense fear. In April of 1981, 14-year-old Colleen Daignault vanished from her home in Surrey. She was a responsible young girl, and her family knew immediately that she had not run away. Just over a month later, on May 19th, 16-year-old Darren Johnsrud disappeared. He was a tourist from Saskatchewan, visiting the area. He was last seen trying to hitchhike. The disappearances were now clearly a pattern, and a dedicated task force was assembled by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, to investigate. The public was warned to be vigilant, and parents across the Lower Mainland held their children close, terrified of the unknown predator who was hunting in their midst. Clifford Olson, meanwhile, was living his double life. He was working, spending time with his family, and interacting with his neighbors, all while secretly carrying out his horrific crimes. He developed a chillingly effective method. He would cruise in his car, looking for young people who were hitchhiking or walking alone. He would offer them a ride, or sometimes he would offer them a job, often claiming to be a construction foreman looking for laborers. He was a skilled manipulator, able to project an air of friendly authority, disarming his potential victims and luring them into his vehicle. Once they were inside, the mask would drop. In June of 1981, the terror continued. 16-year-old Sandra Wolfsteiner disappeared. Then, just a few days later, 13-year-old Ada Court went missing. Police were working frantically, chasing down leads, but they were struggling. The victims seemed to be chosen at random, with no clear connection between them. The predator was leaving behind almost no evidence. The task force grew, and the investigation became one of the largest in Canadian history. It was during this time that Olson's incredible arrogance and his belief in his own cleverness brought him into contact with the very police force that was hunting him. He began calling the ERCMP tip line, offering his services as an informant. He claimed that, as a career criminal, he had connections and could hear things on the street. He would feed the police false leads and misinformation, seemingly enjoying the game of cat and mouse he was playing. He was, in effect, hiding in plain sight, inserting himself into the investigation of his own crimes. This was a classic trait of a psychopathic narcissist, a need to feel superior and to be at the center of the drama. The disappearances continued unabated. In July, the month that would mark the peak of his spree, 6 young people vanished. First, it was 16-year-old Judy Cosma, who disappeared on July 9th. Then, on July 19th, 19-year-old Raymond King Jr. went missing. The very next day, it was 15-year-old Ralph Galezzo. On July 25th, a double disappearance occurred. 14-year-old Susan Partington and 16-year-old Sigrun Arndt, a tourist from Germany, both vanished. Finally, on July 30th, 16-year-old Terry Lynn Carson disappeared. The province was in a state of siege. The media coverage was intense, and the public pressure on the police was immense. The breakthrough in the case came not from a single piece of brilliant detective work, but from a combination of routine police procedure and Olson's own carelessness. On August 12, 1981, Olson picked up 2 female hitchhikers. He drove them to a remote area and assaulted one of them. But the 2 young women managed to escape and immediately reported the incident to the police. Because of his extensive criminal record, Olson was a known quantity to the authorities. The report of this attack, combined with his suspicious informant calls, finally put him on the radar as a potential suspect in the larger investigation. At the same time, an astute RCMP officer named Fred Mayle was doing painstaking, old-fashioned police work. He was meticulously tracking the mileage on suspicious vehicles. He had taken note of a brown Ford LTD that had been rented by Olson. By checking the odometer readings, he was able to determine that Olson had driven an unusually high number of kilometers on the specific days that several of the victims had disappeared. It was a crucial piece of circumstantial evidence that placed Olson in the right areas at the right times. Based on this, Olson was arrested on August 12, 1981, initially for the assault on the hitchhikers. He was held in custody while the police frantically tried to build a case against him for the murders. They knew they had their man, but they lacked the hard evidence, the bodies of most of the victims, and the forensic links to guarantee a conviction. Olson, ever the arrogant manipulator, knew this as well. And it was from this position, from inside a jail cell, that he would make a proposal that would become one of the most controversial and morally fraught deals in the history of Canadian justice. Olson knew that the police were desperate to find the missing children and bring closure to the terrified families. He saw this not as a human tragedy, but as a point of leverage. He told the authorities that he would confess to the killings and lead them to the locations of the bodies, but only for a price. He demanded $100,000 for his cooperation. The money, he stipulated, was to be paid to his wife and son. The proposal created a profound ethical crisis for the RCMP and the Attorney General's office. The idea of paying a killer for information about his own crimes was abhorrent. It felt like rewarding him for his horrific acts. The public outcry, they knew, would be immense. However, they were faced with a terrible choice. Without Olson's cooperation, they might never find the missing children. The families would be left in a state of perpetual uncertainty, and a conviction, while likely, was not guaranteed. Reluctantly, and after much agonizing debate, the authorities agreed to the deal. It became known as the cash for bodies deal. With the agreement in place, Olson began a series of grim excursions with the police. He would be taken from his cell and driven to various remote locations throughout the Lower Mainland. With a chilling lack of emotion, he would point out the hidden graves of his victims. He led them to the remains of Darren Johnsrud, Sandra Wolfsteiner, Ada Court, Judy Cosma, Raymond King, Ralph Galetzo, Susan Partington, Sigrun Arndt, and Terry Lynn Carson. The search for Colleen Desnauts' remains continued, but she was never found. He confessed to a total of 11 killings. The details that emerged from his confessions were stomach-churning. He described how he would overpower his victims, take them to secluded spots, assault them, and then kill them, often by bludgeoning or strangulation. He showed no remorse, no empathy, only a detached pride in his ability to have evaded capture for so long. In January of 1982, Clifford Olson pleaded guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 11 concurrent life sentences, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The cash for bodies deal sparked a massive public and political firestorm. Many felt that the justice system had been compromised, that a deal had been made with evil. The government defended its decision as a necessary evil, the only way to bring the children home and secure a conviction against a monster. The $100,000 was paid into a trust fund for Olson's wife and son. Olson's time in prison was as tumultuous and manipulative as his life on the outside. He continued to play games with the authorities and the media. He would periodically claim to have committed other murders across Canada and the United States, sending police on wild goose chases. He wrote letters to journalists and criminologists, filled with self-aggrandizing claims and twisted justifications for his actions. He applied for parole under the faint hope clause as soon as he was eligible, forcing the families of his victims to relive their trauma by appearing at his parole hearings to protest his release. He was, of course, never granted parole. He remained a constant, painful presence in the Canadian consciousness, a symbol of remorseless evil. Clifford Olson passed away in prison from cancer in September of 2011. His death brought a quiet sense of relief to the families of his victims and to the nation as a whole. The story of Clifford Olson is a dark and cautionary tale. It is a story about the failure of the justice system to recognize the escalating danger of a career criminal. It is a story about the profound vulnerability of youth and the terror that can lurk beneath the surface of a peaceful community. But most of all, it is the story of a man who was not a complex, tormented soul, but a simple black hole of narcissism and cruelty. A man who left behind a legacy of nothing but pain and a quiet, lingering question of how such an evil could have walked so freely among us. Our second case remains in the province of British Columbia, but we move forward in time to the late 1990s and early 2000s. We journey to the gritty, industrial city of Port Coquitlam, a place that lies in the shadow of Vancouver's gleaming towers. Here, on a muddy, cluttered plot of land, lived a quiet and unassuming man who would come to be known as Canada's most prolific serial killer. This is not a story of a predator who roamed far and wide, but of one who brought his victims back to his own dark corner of the world, a place that would become known as the Pig Farm. This is the deeply disturbing story of Robert Willie Pickton. Robert William Pickton was born in 1949. He and his siblings grew up on the family pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a sprawling, disorganized property that had been in their family for generations. He was a socially awkward and quiet child, known to be slow in school. He dropped out early to work on the farm full-time alongside his younger brother, David. The farm was their entire world. They were not part of the suburban community that was growing up around them. They were a throwback to an older, rougher way of life. The farm itself was a chaotic, ramshackle place filled with dilapidated buildings, rusting farm equipment, and junked cars. It was a place of mud and grime and the constant, pungent smell of pigs. As adults, Robert and David Pickton continued to run the farm, though their primary business shifted from raising pigs to other ventures. They ran an unregistered salvage company, and, most notoriously, they started a non-profit organization called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. From a converted barn on their property, they hosted large, wild parties and events. These parties attracted a rough crowd from all over the lower mainland, including bikers, drug users, and sex trade workers from Vancouver's downtown east side. The Piggy Palace became a place known for its lawlessness, a place where people on the margins of society could gather without fear of police interference. Robert Pickton, known to everyone as Willie, was the quiet, strange host of these events. He was often seen wandering through the crowds, a quiet and somewhat goofy figure, but he was largely in the background of his own parties. The story of Pickton's crimes is inextricably linked to the tragic story of Vancouver's downtown east side. This neighborhood for decades has been known as one of the poorest postal codes in Canada. It is a place of immense social suffering, marked by high rates of poverty, homelessness, mental illness, and addiction. It is also a place where a large number of women, many of them from indigenous backgrounds, have been forced into the street-level sex trade to survive. They are among the most vulnerable members of society, often living transient lives, disconnected from their families and from the social safety net. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 90s, women began to disappear from the downtown east side at an alarming rate. One by one, they would simply vanish. Because of the chaotic nature of their lives, their disappearances often went unreported for weeks or even months. When they were reported, the police response was often slow and inadequate. The cases were not linked, and the disappearances were often dismissed as the women having simply moved on or having met with misfortune related to their high-risk lifestyles. But for the families and the community activists who worked in the downtown East Side, it was clear that something terrible was happening. They knew that a predator was at work, targeting the most vulnerable women in the city. They pleaded with the police to take the disappearances seriously, but for years, their calls for a dedicated investigation were largely ignored. The official list of missing women grew, from a handful to dozens. Robert Pickton was not completely unknown to the police. In March of 1997, he was charged with the attempted murder of a sex trade worker he had brought back to his farm. The woman, whose name has been protected by a publication ban, told a harrowing story. She said that Pickton had picked her up in the downtown East Side and taken her to the farm. There, he had attacked her, and a struggle ensued. She managed to grab a knife, slash him, and escape, running naked and bleeding to the street, where she flagged down a passing car. Pickton was arrested and charged. However, the charges were later stayed and eventually dropped. Crown prosecutor felt that the victim, who was a serious drug addict, would not be seen as a credible witness in court. Robert Pickton was allowed to walk free. The system had failed, and this failure would have devastating consequences. The disappearances from the downtown East Side continued. The breakthrough in the case, the one that would finally expose the horror of the pig farm, came from a simple, unrelated tip. In early 2002, a truck driver who had worked for the Pickton brothers went to the police. He told them that he had seen illegal firearms in a trailer on the farm property. On February 5, 2002, the RCMP executed a search warrant on the Pickton farm, looking for the illegal guns. It was during this search that an officer noticed an item in Robert Pickton's trailer that seemed out of place, a prescription asthma inhaler. The officer astutely checked the name on the prescription. It belonged to one of the missing women from the downtown East Side. This discovery triggered one of the largest and most complex forensic investigations in Canadian history. The search warrant was expended, and the farm was declared a massive crime scene. A small army of investigators, forensic anthropologists, and archaeologists descended on the property. What they would uncover over the next year and a half was a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The farm was not just a place of clutter and filth, it was a place of death. The search was a monumental undertaking. Investigators used heavy machinery to sift through tons of soil from the farm. They dismantled buildings piece by piece. They examined the contents of a large meat grinder in one of the workshops. The work was slow, gruesome, and emotionally draining, but slowly the evidence began to emerge. They found the personal belongings of many of the missing women, jewelry, clothing, and identification. And then they began to find human remains. They were not intact bodies, but small fragments of bone and teeth scattered throughout the property. They found remains mixed into the soil, in the slaughterhouse, and inside the meat grinder. Using advanced DNA technology, the forensic team began the painstaking process of identifying the remains. They were able to find the DNA of 33 different women on the property. The true number of victims is believed by many investigators to be much higher, perhaps 49 or even more. The evidence painted a horrifying picture of what had happened at the farm. Pickton would lure women from the downtown East Side with promises of money and drugs. He would bring them back to his trailer or one of the other buildings on the farm, where he would kill them. He would then dispose of their remains in the most gruesome ways imaginable, using the farm's pigs and the meat grinder to erase almost all traces of their existence. While the search was ongoing, the police placed an undercover officer in a jail cell with Robert Pickton. They hoped he would confess. Pickton, believing his cellmate was just another inmate, began to brag. He told the undercover officer that he had killed 49 women and had been planning to make it an even 50. He spoke of his methods in a chillingly casual and detached manner. He described how he would dispose of the remains, explaining that he had a bunch of different ways. He even joked about being sloppy, which is what led to his capture. This secretly recorded confession would become the most powerful piece of evidence against him. The trial of Robert Pickton was a long and complex legal proceeding. Due to the sheer volume of evidence and the number of victims, the prosecution made the controversial decision to proceed with charges on only 26 of the counts, and then to split those into 2 separate trials. The first trial, which began in 2007, focused on 6 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The jury heard from forensic experts who described the DNA findings. They heard the chilling undercover confession, and they heard testimony from several witnesses who described Pickton's strange behavior and his association with many of the missing women. In December of 2007, the jury found Robert Pickton guilty, not of first-degree murder, but of the lesser charge of second-degree murder on all 6 counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence possible. After the verdict, the Crown decided not to proceed with the second trial for the remaining 20 counts, stating that it was not in the public interest, as he was already serving the maximum sentence. This decision was met with anger and frustration from many of the victims' families, who felt that justice had not been fully served for their loved ones. The case of Robert Pickton exposed a series of profound societal and institutional failures. It highlighted the systemic vulnerability of women in the downtown East Side, particularly Indigenous women, who made up a disproportionate number of the victims. It exposed the shocking indifference and incompetence of the police and the justice system, who for years ignored the pleas of a community in crisis. A public inquiry, known as the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, was later held. Its final report was a scathing indictment of the police investigation, concluding that a blatant failure to protect the women of the downtown East Side had allowed Pickton to continue his crimes for years after he should have been stopped. Robert Pickton remains in prison, a quiet, strange man who was responsible for one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history. The pig farm has been dismantled and the land sold, but the memory of what happened there remains. It is a story about a man who was able to operate in plain sight, a predator who exploited the margins of society to carry out his horrific acts. It is a story about a place, a farm that was not just a home. And most importantly, it is a story about the women who were lost, the women whose lives were stolen not only by a killer, but by a society that looked the other way. Their voices, for too long, were unheard, but their memory now serves as a powerful and tragic reminder of the quiet evil that can flourish in the shadows of our communities. Our third story takes us away from the rugged landscapes of the West and into the suburban heartland of southern Ontario. We journey to the late 1980s and early 90s, a time of relative prosperity and suburban comfort. This is not a story of a lone, isolated predator, but of something perhaps even more disturbing, a seemingly perfect, attractive young couple who, behind the closed doors of their neat suburban home, carried out a series of sadistic and horrific crimes. This is a story that shattered Canada's perception of what evil could look like, proving that it can hide behind a bright, smiling, and deceptively normal facade. This is the deeply unsettling story of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. Paul Kenneth Bernardo, born in 1964, grew up in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto. On the surface, he seemed to be a golden boy. He was handsome, charismatic, and intelligent. He did well in school and was a student at the University of Toronto. He dressed impeccably and drove a nice car. He projected an image of confidence and success. But beneath this polished exterior was a deeply disturbed and violent individual. He was a narcissist with a dangerous dark side, a man who harbored violent fantasies and a profound contempt for women. This darkness manifested itself early on in a series of brutal attacks. Between 1987 and 1990, a predator known as the Scarborough Rapist terrorized the eastern suburbs of Toronto. He would break into homes, often stalking his victims for weeks and subject them to horrific assaults. The police were unable to catch him, and the community lived in fear. It would only be years later that the Scarborough Rapist would be identified as Paul Bernardo. Carla Leanne Homolka, born in 1970, grew up in St. Catharines, another southern Ontario city. She, too, seemed to be a picture of normalcy. She was pretty, blonde, and bubbly. She worked as a veterinary assistant and was seen as a bright, friendly young woman. She met Paul Bernardo at a convention in Toronto in 1987, and she was immediately captivated by his charm and good looks. They began a whirlwind romance that seemed, to outsiders, like a fairy tale. They were the perfect couple, young, attractive, and seemingly destined for a happy life together. They became engaged, and in 1991, they were married in a lavish, picturesque ceremony. Carla wore a beautiful white dress, and Paul looked handsome in his tuxedo. The wedding video shows them smiling, laughing, and kissing. But this image was a grotesque lie. The darkness that bound them together had already begun to surface in the most tragic way possible. In December of 1990, just before Christmas, Carla's own younger sister, 15-year-old Tammy Homolka, passed away. At the time, her passing was ruled a tragic accident. The story was that she had choked on her own vomit after drinking too much at a party at the family home. The family was devastated. But the truth, which would only emerge years later, was monstrous. Paul Bernardo had a sick fascination with Tammy. Carla, in a twisted act of devotion to her fiancé, had helped him drug her own sister with halcyon, a powerful sedative, so that he could assault her. The combination of the drugs and the alcohol proved to be a fatal cocktail. They had killed her, and they had gotten away with it. This horrific act was a dark secret that they carried with them into their marriage. After their wedding, Paul and Carla moved into a pristine, pink-sided bungalow in a quiet residential neighborhood in Port Dalhousie, a community in St. Catharines. From the outside, they were the perfect neighbors. They kept their lawn manicured and their house immaculate. But inside this house, which they chillingly referred to as their love nest, they began to escalate their violent fantasies into a horrifying reality. Paul's desire to abduct, confine, and assault young women grew, and Carla, either as a willing participant or as a cowed and abused partner, became his accomplice. Their first victim as a married couple was a young girl from their own neighborhood. On June 15, 1991, just days before their wedding, they abducted 15-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. Leslie was a bright, well-liked high school student. She had been at a friend's funeral and was walking home. Paul and Carla lured her to their car with a simple request for directions. They then forced her into the vehicle and took her back to their house. For the next 24 hours, they held her captive and subjected her to unspeakable abuse, which they meticulously documented on videotape. Afterward, they killed her. They dismembered her remains, encased them in blocks of concrete, and dumped them in a nearby lake. Her remains were discovered 2 weeks later, sending a wave of shock and fear through the community. For months, the police were stumped. The case went cold. Paul and Carla continued to live their seemingly normal lives, their horrific secret hidden behind the walls of their suburban home. Then, in April of 1992, they struck again. They were driving near a church in the city of Burlington when they spotted their next victim. 16-year-old Kristen French was a high school student known for her love of rowing and her bright, friendly personality. She was walking home from school. Paul and Carla, again using the ruse of asking for directions, abducted her. They took her back to their house and held her captive for 3 days. Like Leslie Mahaffey, she was subjected to horrific assaults, all of which were recorded. And then she too was killed. Her body was found in a ditch in a rural area on April 30th. The disappearances and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French created a massive province-wide police investigation. A special task force, known as the Green Ribbon Task Force, was formed. Public was terrified. The two cases were clearly linked, the work of a sadistic couple who were preying on young, innocent girls. Police had some clues, including a description of the couple's car, a beige Nissan, and a composite sketch of Paul Bernardo, but they were struggling to connect the dots. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source: Paul Bernardo's own history of violence. While the police were hunting for the couple who had killed Leslie and Kristen, they were also still investigating the unsolved cases of the Scarborough rapist. Advances in DNA technology allowed them to link the evidence from the various assault scenes. They now had a DNA profile of the rapist. They also had Paul Bernardo's name on a long list of potential suspects. When they compared his DNA to the profile of the Scarborough rapist, they had a match. In February of 1993, Paul Bernardo was arrested for the Scarborough rapes. It was only after his arrest that the police began to seriously consider him as a suspect in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. The connection was his wife, Carla Homolka. Police began to look at her, and the seemingly perfect facade of their marriage began to crumble. Carla, seeing that the net was closing in, made a decision that would forever alter the course of Canadian legal history. She decided to cooperate with the police. Her lawyers negotiated a controversial plea bargain with the Crown prosecutor. In exchange for her testimony against her husband, she would plead guilty to manslaughter and receive a reduced sentence of 12 years in prison. This deal, which would become infamously known as the deal with the devil, was made under the assumption that Carla was a battered and unwilling participant, a victim of her husband's abuse, who had been forced to take part in the crimes. She portrayed herself as a terrified woman who had been under Paul's complete control. At the time, the police did not have the crucial evidence that would have shown the true extent of her involvement, the videotapes. Carla told the police that Paul had hidden the tapes somewhere in their house. A painstaking inch-by-inch search of the home was conducted, but the tapes were not found. The deal was finalized, and Carla pleaded guilty. It was only later, after the house had been turned back over to the couple's lawyer, that the videotapes were discovered, hidden in a light fixture in the basement. The tapes were horrifying. They showed, in graphic and sickening detail, the abuse of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and even Carla's own sister, Tammy. But they also showed something else, something that completely contradicted the story Carla had told. They showed her not as a terrified, unwilling victim, but as an active and, at times, seemingly willing participant. She was seen laughing and joking with Paul as they carried out their horrific acts. The tapes revealed the true, monstrous nature of their partnership. The discovery of the tapes created a public uproar. The deal with the devil was now seen as a catastrophic mistake. The Crown had been duped, but it was too late to undo the plea bargain. Karla Homolka would serve her 12-year sentence, while the full weight of justice fell upon her husband. The trial of Paul Bernardo in 1995 was one of the most sensational and closely watched trials in Canadian history. The evidence presented, including excerpts from the horrific videotapes, shocked the nation to its core. Bernardo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as numerous other charges related to the Scarborough rapes. He was declared a dangerous offender and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Karla Homolka was released from prison in 2005 after serving her full 12-year sentence. Her release was met with public outrage and fear. She changed her name and has since tried to live a quiet life, though her notoriety has followed her. The case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka left a deep and lasting scar on the Canadian psyche. It was a story that destroyed the comforting myth that monsters always look like monsters. It revealed that evil could wear a pretty face, that it could live next door in a neat suburban house, and that it could hide behind a wedding photograph. It is a chilling reminder of the dark and complex nature of human psychology and the terrifying capacity for cruelty that can exist within a partnership, a story of a love nest that was, in reality, a chamber of horrors. Our 4th case takes us back to the city of Vancouver, but to a different era and a different kind of predator. We journey into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, a period of significant social change. This is not a story of overt, brutal violence, but of a quiet and insidious method of killing that allowed a man to operate for decades, his crimes often misidentified as accidents or the tragic consequences of a high-risk lifestyle. This is the story of a man who did not use a weapon in the conventional sense. His weapon was a bottle. He became known as the boozing barber. This is the story of Gilbert Paul Jordan. Gilbert Paul Jordan was born in 1931 in Vancouver. Unlike many of the individuals we have discussed, Jordan did not have a particularly violent or troubled youth. He was a barber by trade, a seemingly ordinary man living a quiet life. However, he had a severe and lifelong struggle with alcoholism. This personal demon would become the central element in his unique and horrifying criminal signature. Jordan was not a predator who sought to inflict physical pain in the typical sense. His compulsion was of a different, more psychological nature. He targeted a specific type of victim, women, particularly Indigenous women, who also struggled with alcoholism. His method was chillingly simple and tragically effective. He would seek out vulnerable women in the bars and on the streets of Vancouver's downtown East Side, the same neighborhood that would later be stalked by Robert Pickton. He would present himself as a friendly drinking companion, a man willing to share his bottle. He would then ply his victims with massive, lethal quantities of alcohol. His goal was to force them to drink until they passed away from acute alcohol poisoning. Because his victims were known to be heavy drinkers, their deaths were often not treated as suspicious by the authorities. They were frequently ruled as accidental, attributed to their chronic alcoholism. This allowed Jordan to kill, again and again, for over 2 decades, with almost complete impunity. The first death officially linked to Gilbert Paul Jordan occurred in 1965. A woman named Ivy Rose was found no longer alive in a Vancouver hotel room. She had passed away from alcohol poisoning. Jordan was the last person seen with her. He was questioned, but there was not enough evidence to charge him with a crime. This would become a familiar pattern. Over the next 20 years, a string of women, mostly from the downtown East Side, would be found in similar circumstances. They were all found in cheap hotel rooms or alleyways, and they had all passed away from consuming a fatal amount of alcohol. And in many of these cases, the last person they were seen with was the friendly barber, Gilbert Paul Jordan. The police were aware of Jordan. He became a person of interest in several investigations. They knew he had a disturbing habit of finding alcoholic women and drinking with them until they were unconscious or worse. But proving a crime was incredibly difficult. Jordan was not forcing the women to drink at gunpoint. He was, on the surface, simply a participant in a consensual activity. The women were drinking willingly. How could the law distinguish between a tragic night of binge drinking and a deliberate act of murder? This legal gray area was the shield that protected Jordan for years. The sheer number of deaths connected to him, however, became impossible to ignore. The list of his potential victims grew. There was Mary Johnson, Patricia Thomas, Patricia Andrew, Vera Harry, and many others. The police, particularly a detective named Don Wilson, became convinced that Jordan was a serial killer. They began to track him, to warn women about him, and to try and build a case that would stick. They would sometimes intervene, finding Jordan in a hotel room with a woman who was unconscious and dangerously intoxicated, and they would rush her to the hospital, saving her life. But they could not watch him 24 hours a day. The case that finally led to a conviction was the death of a woman named Vanessa Buckner. In 1987, Buckner was found no longer alive and naked on the floor of a Vancouver hotel room. She had passed away from alcohol poisoning. The evidence showed that Gilbert Paul Jordan had been with her. He had bought the liquor and had been drinking with her. This time, the Crown decided to proceed with a novel legal strategy. They charged him not with murder, but with manslaughter. The argument was that Jordan, by supplying a lethal amount of alcohol to a person he knew was a chronic alcoholic and therefore vulnerable, had shown a reckless disregard for her life that was equivalent to criminal negligence. The trial was a landmark case in Canadian law. The prosecution presented evidence of Jordan's long history, of the string of women who had passed away in his company. They painted a picture of a man with a clear and pathological pattern of behavior. They brought in medical experts who testified that the amount of alcohol in Buckner's system was so high that it constituted a lethal dose. The defense argued that Jordan was simply a sad, lonely alcoholic who sought out the companionship of similar women, and that Buckner's death was a tragic accident, a result of her own choices. In 1988, the jury found Gilbert Paul Jordan guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The verdict was a victory for the police who had pursued him for so long, but it was a qualified one. Many felt that the sentence was too light for a man believed to be responsible for so many deaths. He was eventually released on parole in the mid-1990s. The police, still convinced he was a danger, took the extraordinary step of issuing a public warning upon his release, alerting the community, and particularly vulnerable women, that the boozing barber was back on the streets. Jordan's final years were spent in and out of trouble for minor offenses, often related to his alcoholism. He passed away in a care home in 2006. The true number of his victims will likely never be known. Estimates range from as low as 10 to as high as 88, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. His case is a disturbing study in a different kind of evil. It is not the explosive violence of a Bernardo or the predatory cunning of an Olson. It is a quiet, insidious evil, a slow and patient method of killing that exploited the vulnerabilities of both his victims and the legal system itself. The story of Gilbert Paul Jordan is also a tragic commentary on the way society views and treats its most marginalized citizen. His victims were women who were already struggling, women whose addictions made them invisible to many. Their deaths were too easily dismissed, their lives undervalued. The boozing barber was able to operate for so long because he chose victims he knew the world was likely to forget. His case is a chilling reminder that a weapon does not have to be a knife or a gun. Sometimes, the most effective weapon can be a simple, shared bottle, offered with a smile that hides the darkest of intentions. Our fifth story takes us across the country to the East Coast, to the Maritime Provinces, a region known for its rugged coastline, its close-knit communities, and its friendly, down-to-earth people. We explore a series of crimes that spanned from the mid-1980s to the late 1990s, the work of a man who was not a sophisticated manipulator or a quiet poisoner, but a brutal and explosive force of violence. This is the story of a man who claimed he was driven by an insatiable hunger, a man who became one of Canada's most feared drifters. This is the story of Michael Wayne McGray. Michael Wayne McGray was born in 1965 and grew up in a small rural community in Nova Scotia. His childhood was marked by dysfunction and instability. He was in and out of foster homes and training schools from a young age. He had early encounters with the law, and by the time he was a young adult, he was already deeply enmeshed in a life of crime. He was a large and physically imposing man, and he developed a reputation for his explosive temper and his capacity for sudden, shocking violence. Unlike the other individuals we have discussed, McGray was not a predator who hid behind a mask of normalcy. He was a man who seemed to be in a constant state of simmering rage. McGray's life was a transient one. He drifted from province to province, from city to city, never staying in one place for long. He worked odd jobs when he had to, but he primarily supported himself through crime. He was a drifter who moved through the underbelly of society, a world of halfway houses, homeless shelters, and cheap rooming houses. It was in this transient world that he found his victims. His first known killing occurred in 1985 when he was just 20 years old. He was living in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He and an accomplice robbed and killed a 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth Gale Tucker. She was a young woman who'd fallen on hard times and was working in the sex trade. McGray was convicted of this crime and sentenced to prison. It was during this first stint in prison for murder that he began to understand his own dark compulsions. He would later claim that it was in prison that the hunger, as he called it, began to grow, a powerful urge to kill that he felt he could not control. He was released from prison in the early 1990s and resumed his transient lifestyle. For the next several years, he drifted across the country, and the list of his victims grew. He was a killer of opportunity, preying on the vulnerable people he encountered in his travels. His victims were often people from the margins of society, fellow inmates, drug dealers, or individuals he met in rooming houses. His method was brutal and direct. He would typically kill his victims by stabbing them repeatedly. The attacks were frenzied and overkill, a clear indication of the rage that drove him. In 1991, he killed 2 men in St. John, New Brunswick. Robert Asoli and Gayton Ethia were 2 gay men who he had met and gone back to their apartment with. He killed them both. The crime scene was brutal, and the police had few leads. McGray, ever the drifter, had already moved on, leaving a trail of death behind him. His most notorious crime, the one that would ultimately lead to his final capture, occurred in 1998 in the city of Moncton, New Brunswick. He was living in a rooming house when he got into a dispute with a fellow resident, a woman named Joan Hicks. He killed her, and then, in a final horrific act, he also killed her 11-year-old daughter, Nina. The killing of a child shocked the community to its core and launched a massive police investigation. McGray was identified as the prime suspect, and a nationwide manhunt was launched. He was finally arrested a short time later. After his capture, he began to do something that is relatively rare for serial killers. He began to confess. He seemed almost eager to talk about his crimes, to explain the hunger that he claimed drove him. He confessed to the murders of Joan and Nina Hicks. He confessed to the 1991 murders of Robert Asoli and Gayton Ethier. And he began to claim responsibility for many other unsolved murders across the country. He claimed to have killed as many as 16 people, from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. He provided details about some of these alleged crimes, but in many cases, the police were unable to corroborate his stories. It was difficult to determine what was a truthful confession and what was the boastful exaggeration of a man who wanted to be seen as Canada's most terrifying killer. However, he was officially convicted of 7 murders, making him one of the country's most prolific serial killers. In 2000, Michael Wayne McGray was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. His time in the prison system has been as violent and troubled as his life on the outside. He has been involved in numerous assaults on other inmates and prison staff. He was involved in a hostage-taking incident in a Quebec prison. He is considered one of the most dangerous offenders in the Canadian correctional system. In a series of chilling interviews he gave to the media from prison, McGray spoke in a calm, articulate, and terrifyingly rational voice about his desire to kill. He explained the hunger as a powerful, addictive urge that would build up inside him until he could no longer control it. He claimed that the killing was the only thing that would make the feeling go away, at least for a little while. He also made a statement that sent a chill through the entire country. He said that if he were ever released from prison, he would kill again. He said it was not a matter of if, but when. He even begged the authorities to never let him out, stating that he could not stop himself. The story of Michael Wayne McGray is a raw and brutal look into the mind of a killer who makes no excuses. He is not a charming manipulator or quiet, unassuming neighbor. He is a man who seems to be a pure vessel of rage and violence. His story is a journey through the dark, transient underbelly of the country, a world that is invisible to most Canadians. His victims were people who were already living on the edge, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. He is a stark reminder that even in a peaceful country, there are dark roads and forgotten corners where profound and explosive evil can travel, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. For our 6th story, we remain on the East Coast, but we travel to a place of deep woods and winding rivers, the Miramichi region of New Brunswick. We go back in time to the year 1989. This is a story about a man who was not a drifter. He was a man who wore a mask, both literally and figuratively. A predator who turned the familiar, comforting woods of his hometown into a place of fear. He became known as the monster of the Miramichi. This is the story of Alan Legere. Alan Joseph Legere was born in 1948 in Chatham, New Brunswick. His early life was difficult, marked by poverty and a lack of stability. He had a troubled relationship with the law from a young age, accumulating a record for petty crimes. As a young man, he was known as a smooth talker, a charismatic but untrustworthy character. He was physically imposing and had a reputation for being a bully and a tough guy. His criminal career escalated from theft and arson to more serious, violent crimes. In 1986, Legere was convicted of murder. He and two accomplices had robbed a convenience store owned by an elderly couple, John and Mary Glendon. During the robbery, they had brutally beaten the couple. Mary Glendenning survived, but her husband, John, passed away from his injuries. Leger was sentenced to life in prison and was sent to a maximum security institution. For the community of the Miramichi, it seemed that the dangerous man was off the streets for good. But they were wrong. On May 3rd, 1989, Alan Leger accomplished what few inmates at a maximum security prison ever do. He escaped. He had been taken to a hospital in the nearby city of Moncton for treatment for an ear infection. Despite being considered a high-risk inmate, he was escorted by only 2 guards. In the hospital washroom, he had managed to pick the lock on his handcuffs and leg irons using a small piece of metal he had concealed. He emerged from the washroom holding a homemade knife and confronted the guards. He then fled the hospital, hijacked a car, and vanished. The escape of a convicted killer sparked immediate fear in the Miramichi region. The police launched a massive manhunt, but Leger was a woodsman. He knew the forests and back roads of the area like the back of his hand. He was able to live off the land, breaking into remote cabins and cottages for food and supplies. He was a ghost in the woods, and the community was terrified. They knew he was out there, and they knew he was dangerous. For the next 7 months, Alan Leger waged a one-man war of terror on the community he felt had wronged him. He was driven by a thirst for revenge against those he blamed for his murder conviction. He began a series of brutal home invasions, targeting people he believed had testified against him or had cooperated with the police. His method was savage. He would break into homes in the dead of night, wearing a mask to conceal his identity. He would brutally beat his victims, torture them for information about valuables, and then kill them before setting their houses on fire to destroy the evidence. His first victim after his escape was an elderly woman named Annie Flam, a shopkeeper who lived alone. He broke into her home, assaulted and killed her, and then set the house ablaze. The community was horrified. The monster was not just hiding, he was hunting. The fear was palpable. People locked their doors and windows, something that was uncommon in these small, trusting communities. They bought guns to protect themselves. The sense of peace and security that had defined the region was shattered. Leger struck again. He targeted 2 elderly sisters, Donna and Linda Dorney. He broke into their home, subjected them to a horrific ordeal, and then killed them both before, once again, setting fire to the house. The pattern was clear. He was a predator of the most sadistic kind, preying on the most vulnerable members of the community. His final victim was a beloved local priest, Father James Smith. Leger broke into the rectory, beat and killed the priest, and then, as was his signature, he set the building on fire. The murder of a priest sent a new wave of shock and outrage through the province. The manhunt for Alan Leger intensified, becoming one of the largest in Canadian history. The police were under immense pressure to catch him. The breakthrough in the case came from a combination of modern technology and old-fashioned luck. The police were able to obtain a DNA sample that they believed belonged to the killer. At the time, DNA profiling was a new and revolutionary forensic tool. They were also getting tips from the public. On November 24th, 1989, a taxi driver reported that he had given a ride to a man he believed was Alan Leger. The tip led the police to a location near a railway line. The police cornered Leger in a stolen vehicle during a snowstorm. He tried to flee, but the car got stuck. He was captured at gunpoint, bringing his 7-month reign of terror to an end. The sense of relief in the Miramichi was overwhelming. The trial of Alan Leger in 1991 was a landmark case. It was one of the first major trials in Canada to use DNA evidence to secure conviction. The DNA found at the crime scenes was a perfect match to Leger. The evidence was irrefutable. He was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, as well as numerous other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, and this time there would be no escape. He was sent to Canada's Supermax prison, a special handling unit in Quebec, where he remains to this day. The story of the monster of the Miramichi is a harrowing tale of a community under siege. It is a story about the failure of the correctional system to contain a dangerous offender, and the terror that can be unleashed when a predator is let loose in a place he knows intimately. Alan Leger was not just a killer. He was a force of nature, a storm of violence that swept through a peaceful community and left a trail of devastation. His case brought modern forensic science to the forefront of Canadian justice, but it also left behind a dark and enduring legacy in the woods and rivers of the Miramichi, a reminder of the 7 terrifying months when a monster walked among them. Our 7th story takes us to the heart of the country, to the prairie province of Manitoba and the city of Winnipeg. We journey back to the 1960s and 70s. This is a story about a man who, for years, was a phantom, a predator who slipped into homes in the dead of night and took lives, leaving behind almost no clues. His crimes were so baffling and seemingly random that the city was gripped by a quiet, simmering fear for over a decade. He was known only by the chilling moniker given to him by the press, the Bedroom Strangler. This is the story of John Norman Collins. John Norman Collins was not a Canadian. He was an American citizen, born in 1947. He grew up in Michigan and was at Eastern Michigan University. He was, by all accounts, a clean-cut, handsome, and popular young man. He was a good student and was well liked by his peers. He had a steady girlfriend. There was nothing in his outward appearance or behavior to suggest the dark predator that lay beneath the surface. His connection to Canada was through his service in the United States Air Force, which had stationed him at a base in Grand Forks, North Dakota, just a short drive from the Canadian border and the city of Winnipeg. The series of crimes that would later be attributed to Collins began in his home state of Michigan. Between 1967 and 1969, a number of young women were abducted and killed in the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti area. The cases were known as the Michigan Murders, and they created a climate of intense fear in the region. The victims were all young students, and they had all been brutally killed. The police in Michigan were hunting for a serial killer. What they didn't know was that their suspect was also crossing the border and committing similar crimes in Canada. The first case in Winnipeg that would be linked to the Bedroom Strangler occurred in 1969. A 57-year-old woman named Irene Paskar was found in her home. She had been assaulted and killed by strangulation. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that she had either let her killer in or that he had been able to enter her home without leaving a trace. The police had few leads, and the case went cold. Over the next several years, a pattern of similar crimes emerged. The victims were all women, and they were all killed in their own homes, usually in their bedrooms. The killer would enter the house silently, often through an unlocked door or window. He would then overpower his victims, assault them, and strangle them, often using an item of their own clothing. He was a ghost, leaving behind no fingerprints and no witnesses. The city of Winnipeg was terrified. Women were afraid to be alone in their own homes. The police were under immense pressure, but they were dealing with a killer who was incredibly careful and methodical. The list of victims grew. There was Barbara Stoppel, a young woman who was killed in the laundromat where she worked. There was Mary Elizabeth Sotos, a young student. There was Diane Miller, another young woman killed in her own apartment. The cases were all slightly different, but they all bore the hallmarks of the same patient and ruthless predator. The police task force assigned to the case struggled to find a common link between the victims. They seemed to be chosen at random, which made the crimes all the more terrifying. The breakthrough in the case came not from Winnipeg, but from Michigan. The police investigating the Michigan murders had finally zeroed in on a suspect, John Norman Collins. The key piece of evidence came from his own uncle, who was a state police officer. The uncle had noticed similarities between the composite sketches of the suspect in the Michigan murders and his own nephew. He also knew that Collins had been in the area at the time of the killings. He reluctantly reported his suspicions. The police began to build a case against Collins. They discovered that he had a history of petty crimes and a strange, unsettling demeanor that was hidden behind his clean-cut image. They found witnesses who could place him near the scenes of some of the crimes. In 1969, John Norman Collins was arrested and charged with the murder of a young woman in Michigan. It was only after his arrest in the United States that the police in Winnipeg began to seriously consider him as a suspect in their bedroom strangler cases. The timeline matched. Collins had been stationed in North Dakota during the period of the Winnipeg killings, and he had easy access to the city. The method of the crimes in Michigan was hauntingly similar to the method of the crimes in Winnipeg. The police in both countries began to share information. The evidence against Collins was largely circumstantial, but it was compelling. They were able to show that he had been in the vicinity of the Winnipeg crimes on the days they were committed. They found witnesses who had seen a man matching his description near the victims' homes. The case against him was built piece by piece, a mosaic of timelines, witness statements, and similar patterns of behavior. In 1970, John Norman Collins was convicted of first-degree murder for the crime in Michigan and was sentenced to life in prison. He was never officially tried for the crimes in Winnipeg. The Canadian authorities decided that, since he was already serving a life sentence in the United States, it was not necessary to go through the expense and difficulty of extraditing him for another trial. However, the Winnipeg police officially closed their files on several of the bedroom strangler cases, confident that they had their man. They believe he was responsible for at least 4, and possibly as many as 8, of the killings in their city. John Norman Collins has always maintained his innocence. He has spent over 50 years in prison, denying any involvement in the murders in both Michigan and Winnipeg. He remains in a prison in Michigan to this day. The story of the bedroom strangler is a chilling example of a cross-border crime spree. It is the story of a man who was able to use the border as a shield, committing crimes in 2 different countries and confounding 2 different police forces. He was a predator who lived a secret life, his handsome, all-American image a perfect mask for the cold-blooded killer that lay beneath. For the city of Winnipeg, the case left a lasting legacy of fear, a reminder of the years when a phantom slipped through their quiet residential streets, a silent and deadly intruder who turned the safest of places, a person's own bedroom, into a scene of unimaginable terror. For our 8th story, we return to the province of Ontario and to the city of Toronto. We explore a series of crimes that took place in the 1980s. The work of a man whose strange and specific fetish would become his calling card and ultimately lead to his downfall. This is a story about a predator who was not just a violent offender, but a man driven by a bizarre and powerful compulsion, a man who terrorized a city and became known as the footwear rapist. This is the story of Paul Snow. Paul Cecil Snow was born in 1953. Unlike many of the individuals we have discussed, he did not have a long and violent criminal record from a young age. He was a married man with children, living a seemingly ordinary life in the suburbs of Toronto. He worked as a school caretaker. He was a quiet, unassuming man who did not draw attention to himself. But he harbored a dark and powerful secret, a paraphilia or fetish that was centered on women's footwear, particularly boots. This obsession would escalate from a private fantasy into a violent and terrifying crime spree. Between 1982 and 1986, a series of brutal home invasions and assaults occurred in the East End of Toronto. Predator would target women who lived alone, often stalking them for a period of time to learn their routines. He would break into their homes, usually at night, and subject them to horrific assaults. The police quickly realized they were dealing with a serial offender. The attacks were methodical and followed a chillingly consistent pattern. But there was one detail that was particularly strange, a ritual that the attacker performed in every single case. After the assault, he would steal a pair of his victim's boots or high-heeled shoes. This specific and unusual act became his signature. The police and the media dubbed him the footwear rapist. The fetish was not just an afterthought. It seemed to be a central part of his violent fantasy. The city of Toronto was gripped by fear. The attacks were audacious and terrifying. The idea of a man breaking into a woman's home, her safest space, was a nightmare realized. The police formed a dedicated task force and launched a massive investigation. They had a description of the attacker, but he was skilled at not leaving behind evidence. He was a careful and patient predator. The investigation was a long and frustrating one. The police interviewed hundreds of potential suspects. They used early forms of psychological profiling to try and understand the mind of the man they were hunting. They knew they were looking for someone with a specific and powerful fetish, a man for whom footwear was a key part of his violent compulsion. The breakthrough in the case came from a combination of good police work and a stroke of luck. The police had been conducting surveillance on a number of potential suspects. One of these men was Paul Snow. He had come to their attention through a minor, unrelated incident, but something about him had raised a red flag. On a hunch, the police decided to put him under surveillance. What they discovered was a man living a secret life. They followed him as he went about his daily routine, working at the school, spending time with his family. But they also followed him as he prowled through residential neighborhoods at night, peering into windows, seemingly searching for his next victim. They knew they were on the right track. The police needed more than just suspicion. They needed hard evidence. They obtained a warrant, searched Paul Snow's home. And what they found in his basement was a hidden, secret world that confirmed their worst fears. They found a massive collection of women's footwear, hundreds of pairs of boots and high-heeled shoes. They were his trophies, a library of his crimes. They also found other items he had stolen from his victims, as well as journals in which he had detailed his violent fantasies. Paul Snow was arrested in 1986. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The collection of footwear, the journals, and the witness identifications from his surviving victims painted a clear and damning picture. He was charged with a string of assaults and break-and-enters. The trial of Paul Snow was a sensation. The details of his crimes, and particularly his strange fetish, were shocking to the public. He was found guilty on multiple counts and was sentenced to life in prison. He was declared a dangerous offender, a designation reserved for Canada's most violent and incorrigible criminals. The story of the footwear rapist is a disturbing look into the strange and complex world of criminal psychology. It is a reminder that the motivations for violent crime are not always simple or rational. Paul Snow was not driven by greed or by a simple desire for power. He was driven by a powerful and twisted obsession, a compulsion that turned an ordinary object into a symbol of violence and terror. His case left a lasting mark on the city of Toronto, a chilling story of a quiet school caretaker who, under the cover of darkness, became a city's nightmare, a predator defined by the strange and terrifying signature he left behind. For our ninth story, we venture into the vast, frozen wilderness of Canada's far north. We travel back in time to the 1930s, to the rugged and unforgiving landscape of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. This is not a story of a serial killer in the traditional sense, but of a lone, mysterious figure who became the subject of one of the largest and most legendary manhunts in Canadian history. He was a man with no name, no past, and an almost superhuman ability to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. He became known as the Mad Trapper of Rat River. The story begins in the winter of 1931. A mysterious man who called himself Albert Johnson arrived in the small, remote community of Fort McPherson. He was a quiet, solitary man who spoke with a slight Scandinavian accent. He seemed to have plenty of money, and he bought supplies to build a small, isolated cabin on the banks of the Rat River. The local trappers and the members of the Gwich'in First Nation found him to be strange and reclusive. He avoided contact with others and seemed to be guarding a deep secret. The first complaint against Johnson was lodged with the local RCMP detachment. Some of the First Nations trappers reported that someone was interfering with their trap lines, stealing their catches and, in some cases, hanging the traps on trees, an act of deliberate sabotage. Their suspicions fell on the mysterious newcomer, Albert Johnson. An ICMP constable named Alfred King decided to pay Johnson a visit to investigate the complaint. He trekked through the snow to Johnson's remote cabin. The cabin was a small, fortress-like structure with peepholes in the walls instead of windows. When Constable King knocked on the door, Johnson refused to speak to him or let him in. King, faced with this silent refusal, had no choice but to make the long journey back to Aklavik to get a search warrant. A few days later, Constable King returned with another officer, Constable Joe Verville, and the search warrant. They surrounded the small cabin and again demanded that Johnson come out. Again, there was only silence. Then, without warning, a shot rang out from one of the peepholes in the cabin wall. Constable King was hit and seriously wounded. The other officer dragged his partner to safety, and a tense standoff began. The story of the shootout with the mysterious trapper spread quickly, and a posse of local trappers and RCMP officers was formed. They returned to the cabin, this time armed with dynamite. They besieged the small structure for hours in the brutal, sub-zero temperatures. They threw sticks of dynamite onto the roof, eventually blowing it off and collapsing the cabin. Believing that no one could have survived the blast, they cautiously approached the ruins. But Albert Johnson was not only alive, he was still fighting. He emerged from the wreckage, firing his rifle, and managed to escape into the darkness of the Arctic winter. This began a manhunt that would capture the imagination of the entire world. For the next month and a half, Albert Johnson led the RCMP on an incredible chase across hundreds of kilometers of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. The temperatures were often 50 degrees below zero. He traveled on foot, without a sled or dogs, surviving in conditions that should have been impossible. He was a master of wilderness survival. He would use the frozen riverbeds to hide his tracks, and he would build hidden shelters to rest. The RCMP, led by Inspector Alexander Ames, were relentless in their pursuit. They used dog sleds, and for the first time in a major manhunt, they employed an airplane. A bush pilot named Wop May was hired to use his ski-equipped plane to spot Johnson from the air, a revolutionary tactic at the time. The radio broadcasts from the manhunt captivated the nation. The newspapers dubbed Johnson the Mad Trapper of Rat River, and he became a folk hero to some, a symbol of rugged individualism and defiance against authority. The chase was a grueling ordeal. The pursuers were constantly battling frostbite and exhaustion. Johnson, it seemed, was indefatigable. He led them over the Richardson Mountains, a feat that was considered impossible in the dead of winter. He was wounded in one shootout, but managed to escape again. The final confrontation came on February 17, 1932. Wop May, from his airplane, spotted Johnson's tracks on a frozen stretch of the Eagle River in the Yukon. He relayed the location to the ground posse. The ERC-NP cornered Johnson in the middle of the frozen river. A final, traumatic shootout ensued. Johnson, outnumbered and outgunned, took cover behind his backpack and fought to the end. During the battle, an RCMP officer, Constable Edgar Millen, was killed. Finally, Albert Johnson was shot and killed. The epic manhunt was over, but the mystery of the Mad Trapper was just beginning. When the police examined his remains, they found a man who was still a complete enigma. He had over $2,000 in cash on him, as well as a collection of gold fillings and teeth that were not his own. He had several firearms and a large amount of ammunition, but he had no identification, no letters, no personal items that could give any clue as to who he was or where he came from. His fingerprints did not match any on record. The name Albert Johnson was almost certainly an alias. Who was the Mad Trapper of Rat River? The question has fascinated historians and amateur sleuths for decades. Was he a draft dodger from the First World War? A fugitive from justice in the United States? A lonely prospector who had simply been driven mad by the isolation of the North? No one knows for sure. Modern forensic analysis of his remains has suggested that he was likely in his 30s and had spent time in the United States. But his true identity remains one of Canada's greatest unsolved mysteries. The story of the Mad Trapper is a tale that has become a legend. It is a story of incredible endurance, of a lone man's desperate battle against both the law and the brutal forces of nature. It is a testament to the vast, wild, and untamable spirit of the Canadian North. And it is a story that ends, not with an answer, but with a silent, frozen figure on a river of ice, a man who carried his secrets with him to the grave, forever a ghost in the vast, white wilderness. For our final story, we return to the present day and to a mystery that is not in the past, but is tragically ongoing. We travel back to the vast, remote, and beautiful landscape of northern British Columbia. Here, a single, lonely stretch of pavement cuts through the dense wilderness, a lifeline for the small, isolated communities scattered throughout the region. This is Highway 16, but for decades, it has been known by another, more sinister name, the Highway of Tears. This is not the story of a single killer, but a story of a place, a road that has become a hunting ground, and a heartbreaking story of systemic failure, profound loss, and a search for justice that continues to this day. The Highway of Tears is a 725-kilometer, or 450-mile, stretch of Highway 16 that runs between the cities of Prince George and Prince Rupert in northern British Columbia. It is a stunningly beautiful drive, flanked by dense forests, towering mountains, and pristine lakes. But it is also a place of immense isolation. The distances between towns are vast, and for long stretches, there is nothing but wilderness. There is limited cell phone service, and public transportation is scarce. For the residents of the many small, often impoverished communities along the route, particularly the numerous First Nations reserves, travel can be difficult. For those without a vehicle, hitchhiking is often the only option to get to a neighboring town for work, school, or a medical appointment. This reliance on hitchhiking has created a situation of extreme vulnerability. Since the late 1960s, a disturbingly high number of women and girls have disappeared or have been found murdered along this highway and the adjacent roadways. The official number, according to the ERC-EMP's Project EPANA, which was established to investigate the cases, is 18. However, community leaders and indigenous organizations believe the true number is much higher, perhaps closer to 50 or even more. The vast majority of these victims are indigenous women and girls. The stories of the victims are heartbreakingly similar. They are stories of young women with bright futures, of beloved daughters, sisters, and mothers. There is the story of Gloria Moody, a 26-year-old mother of two, who was last seen leaving a pub in Williams Lake in 1969. Her remains were found 10 days later by a hunter. There is the story of Micheline Parr, an 18-year-old who was last seen hitchhiking in 1970. Her remains were found years later. There is the story of Ramona Wilson, a 16-year-old from Smithers, who disappeared in 1994 while trying to hitchhike to a friend's house. Her remains were found nearly a year later. The list goes on, a heartbreaking litany of lives cut short. For decades, these cases were not treated as a connected phenomenon. They were individual tragedies, investigated by small, under-resourced police detachments scattered along the highway. The response from the authorities was often criticized as being slow and inadequate. The families of the victims, particularly the indigenous families, felt that their loved ones were not valued, that their cases were not a priority. They felt that a wall of systemic racism and indifference stood between them and justice. It was the tireless advocacy of the victims' families and indigenous leaders that finally forced the issue into the national consciousness. They organized marches, held vigils, and put up billboards along the highway, bearing the faces of the missing and murdered women. They gave the highway its name, the Highway of Tears, a powerful and evocative title that captured the decades of pain and loss. They demanded a coordinated police response and a public inquiry. In 2005, the RCMP finally launched Project EPANA, a dedicated task force to investigate the string of unsolved cases along the highway. The investigation has been incredibly complex. The vast geographical area, the decades that have passed in some of the cases, and the lack of witnesses or forensic evidence have made the work incredibly difficult. The police have explored the possibility of one or more serial killers operating along the highway over the years. The transient nature of the region, with its logging camps, mining operations, and seasonal workers, means that many people have passed through the area over the decades, some of whom may have been responsible. The investigation has produced a few suspects and has led to a conviction in one of the cases. In 2012, a man named Cody Lejebelkoff, a young man from the Prince George area, was convicted of the murders of 4 women. One of his victims was on the official Project EPA list. This conviction brought a small measure of justice, but it did not solve the majority of the cases. The police have also identified another prime suspect in several of the cases, an American convicted killer named Bobby Jack Fowler. Fowler was a transient construction worker who spent time in British Columbia in the 1970s. DNA evidence has linked him to at least one of the Highway of Tears victims, and he is suspected in several others. Fowler passed away in an American prison in 2006, so he will never be tried for these crimes. The reality is that there's likely not a single Highway of Tears killer. It is more probable that a number of different predators have used the isolation and vulnerability of the highway to their advantage over the decades. The highway itself has become the monster. The story of the Highway of Tears is more than just a true crime mystery. It is a story about a profound and ongoing national tragedy. It has become a symbol of the larger crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, an issue that has been described as a national genocide. It has exposed the deep-seated issues of systemic racism, poverty, and the lingering effects of colonialism that have created a situation where Indigenous women are disproportionately victims of violence. In response to the tireless pressure from activists, the Canadian government has launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The inquiry's final report, released in 2019, was a damning indictment of decades of government and police failure. It called for sweeping changes to the justice system, to social services, and to the relationship between the government and Indigenous peoples. Today, when you drive along the Highway of Tears, you will still see the billboards with the faces of the missing women. They are a constant, haunting reminder that this is not just a beautiful, scenic route. It is a place of sorrow and a place of ongoing risk. Efforts have been made to improve safety, with new bus services and cell phone towers being installed. But the deep social issues that create the vulnerability remain. The Highway of Tears is a story without an ending. The search for answers for so many families continues, and the highway itself remains a quiet, beautiful, and deeply tragic stretch of road. A place where the echoes of unspeakable loss are carried on the wind that blows through the northern pines. And so, our journey across the quiet landscapes and into their darkest shadows comes to a close. These stories remind us that evil is not a storm that rages, but often a quiet cold that seeps in, and that its presence can be found anywhere, in any community. They are difficult stories, but their telling is a quiet act of remembrance for the lives that were lost. Thank you for joining us in this somber reflection. If you found this narrative helpful for relaxation or for sleep, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more quiet mysteries. We invite you to share in the comments which story will linger in your thoughts. Until next time, may your mind be calm and may your sleep peaceful.